Chapter 25, Grand Finale. Henri had dashed to the telephone to summon help, but the wires had been cut. "There's only one chance for escape," Nancy declared. "We'll have to make a rope out of sheets and blankets and swing out the window beyond the flames." As she and George dashed to a bed, Hélène, standing near a window, cried, "René is outside!" Henri rushed to her side and peered below. "And that's Red Busby with him!" "Help! Help!" Bess screamed. The men looked up and sneered. Turning on their heels, they went down the lane. "They can't run off and leave us!" Bess wailed frantically. There was no doubt now in Nancy's mind that the men had purposely set the fire after knocking out Officer Donovan. But there was no time now for reflection. Nancy and the others tore the bedsheets and knotted them together. One end of the lifeline was tied securely to a leg of the bed, which was shoved close to the window. At this moment, they heard a car pull away and concluded René and Busby had gone off. "George," said Nancy, "suppose you climb out first." The athletic girl gripped the rope, started down the side of the building, then kicked herself away from it. She half leaped, half fell safely to the ground, just beyond the burning area of grass. George held on to the end of the line to keep it from falling into the flames and swung it over a branch of a scorched maple nearby. She held it taut as Bess swung hand over hand to safety. Hélène followed, then Nancy, the papers from Koff's briefcase stuffed in her pockets, and finally Henri. No sooner had the young man jumped to the ground than the whole farmhouse seemed to collapse. The group were hardly conscious of the intense heat from the flames, as, in relief, they hugged one another, alternately laughing and crying hysterically. Their faces were black with soot, and the smoke made their eyes smart. "Let's go," Bess urged. "I can't get away from here fast enough." Suddenly, Nancy remembered Officer Donovan. They found him at the edge of the woods. The guard was just regaining consciousness. A car turned into the lane at that moment. "Oh, it must be those dreadful men," Bess cried. "We'd better hide so they can't harm us." Nancy agreed, but not for the reason Bess had given. She felt that it would be an excellent opportunity to capture Busby and René. To Bess's relief, the occupant of the car proved to be Ned Nickerson. As he leaped to the ground, Nancy and the others stepped from hiding. Ned looked at the Fontaines as if he were seeing two ghosts. Then he stared at the disheveled condition of the group and at the burning farmhouse. "Whatever happened?" he asked. Explanations were quickly given, then Nancy asked how Ned knew where they were. "I called your house, Nancy, to find out how you felt today," the young man replied. "Your father answered. He said you were here and that he had been trying to get you on the phone, but there was no answer. He seemed quite concerned, so I offered to come and find you." "Did Dad say why he was trying to get me?" Nancy asked. Ned smiled. "He has solved part of your mystery, Nancy. He found out from the French embassy that 10561B24 is the number of the passport issued to Raoul Amiens." "Oh, Nancy, you were right," George declared. "Now Judson can't deny who he really is." Nancy felt that they should notify the fire department and the police at once. "Maybe the barn can be saved," she said. "And furthermore, I have a hunch René and Busby will come back here to find out the result of their horrible deed." Officer Donovan said he would radio headquarters and the fire department from the police car. He set off to the spot in the woods where the sedan had been secreted. "The rest of us can hide in the woods until the police come," Nancy said. "If René and Busby should show up, you boys can take care of them." "Nothing would please me better," said Ned, and Henri added, Just let me get my hands on either one of them. Shortly afterward, Officer Donovan joined the group. He said that the police and fire trucks would be there immediately. Then he told them about his being slugged. I kept smelling kerosene and was trying to investigate where it was coming from when someone came up behind and hit me on the head. Suddenly, Ned grabbed Nancy's arm and pointed. Shh, he warned the group. Coming from the woods at the back of the barn were Renee and Busby. Ned and Henri, crouching low, cautiously inched their way forward. When the men were almost opposite them, they leaped from their hiding place and hurled themselves at the two suspects. The ensuing fight was of short duration. While Ned and Henri held Renee and Busby in vice-like grips, Officer Donovan handcuffed the prisoners. Renee began to whine. You have no right to hold me. I haven't done anything. This is my home that burned down. You ought to have a little sympathy instead of putting handcuffs on me. One or both of you men set fire to the house and tried to burn it down with us in it, Nancy challenged. Both prisoners vehemently denied the charge. Anyway, there is a much more serious charge against you, Busby, which you can't deny, declared Henri. Kidnapping. And now, Busby, said Nancy, suppose you tell us where Raoul Amiens is. Busby smirked. What would it be worth to you to know? My price is high. Nancy looked at the man in disgust. Right now, you're not in a very good bargaining position, she said. We'll find out soon enough. Mrs. Amiens is in jail, and when she finds out you people are our prisoners, she'll tell us where her husband is. At that moment, they heard the sound of fire sirens, and presently several pieces of apparatus pulled into the lane. Within 15 minutes, the fire was under control. Captain Crane arrived in a police car with several other officers. The men praised Nancy and all of her friends for their part in the capture of Renee and Busby. Captain Crane said that Mrs. Amiens had broken down and given her husband's address. Officers had been sent to get him. Suppose we go back to headquarters and try to get statements from all the gang, the captain suggested. He invited Nancy to ride with him and the two other prisoners who would be handcuffed to another officer in the rear seat of his car. You probably have a few questions to ask them, he said, a twinkle in his eye. Nancy was glad of this opportunity. When she brought up the subject of Mr. Koff's briefcase, Busby admitted having been on the plane and switching cases while pretending to comfort the distraught man. I had heard that Koff was working for the Centrovian Underground, said Busby, and when he started making a fuss on the plane, I was sure he had some valuable information in his briefcase. So I decided to get it. My own briefcase was almost a duplicate of his, so it was easy to make the switch. Nancy then asked if he and Amiens, alias Judson, had worked the scheme of trying to get money from Mr. Koff. Busby confessed that the two had worked it out together, but the plan had failed when Koff had turned the matter over to Mr. Drew. Nancy learned also that it was Amiens who had trailed Koff and his daughter Millie to Cliffwood. Also, it was Amiens' idea to use his passport number under stamps as an identification mark on all correspondence between members of the conspiracy. Anyone else sending phony orders could be detected. The racketeer was amazed to learn that one of the slips containing the number had been found in the figurine. He surmised that it had been slipped in accidentally when the jewels were being secreted. You're too smart, Miss Drew, he said. But one of these days you'll come across somebody you won't be able to outsmart. Nancy ignored the remark and asked if it were Busby and Duparc who had sold the figurines and paintings in which the jewels had been smuggled to the United States. Yeah, said Busby. We saw a way to make a few extra bucks and get rid of the hot paintings, too." He glared in hatred at Nancy when she told him that the smugglers had failed to remove a few of the jewels. "Who called my father that night, pretending to be Koff, and asked him to go to New York?" Nancy asked. "Duparc," Busby answered. "He's good at imitating voices and was able to convince your father he was Koff." Captain Crane parked the police car in front of headquarters, and they all went inside. Mr. and Mrs. Amiens, alias Judson, were waiting. The husband sprang at René like a cat, but was quickly dragged away. Amiens and his wife looked balefully at Nancy, but remained quiet and finally answered the various questions put to them. Nancy learned that it was Amiens who had written all the threatening notes, both to the Fontaines and to her. Finally, Nancy turned to Mrs. Judson and asked, "What was your part in this business?" "My husband forced me to do all sorts of things," she replied. "He made me write the anonymous notes to the parents of the dancing school kids. One day, when I went over to River Heights to check with Red Busby, I decided to steal the Scarlet slippers." "That was your husband's idea, too?" Nancy asked. "No," Mrs. Amiens admitted. "That was my own idea. I heard my husband say to Duparc that the jewels had been hidden in the Scarlet slippers. I didn't know he meant the ones in the portrait, so when I saw the pair on the wall of the dancing school, I decided to take them. Of course, there wasn't anything in the slippers." Before Nancy and her friends left headquarters, René and Busby admitted setting fire to the farmhouse. The police had taken Duparc into custody. He had been trying to make a getaway with the same man and woman Ned had thought were the Fontaines. The foreign authorities had already been notified to pick up the Parisian friend of Amiens who had sent the letter that Mrs. Amiens had picked up at the River Heights post office. The next day, the River Heights Gazette and newspapers all over the country featured the story of Nancy Drew and the mystery of the Scarlet slippers. The young detective was deluged with telephone calls and wires. One call made her smile broadly. It came from Mrs. Parsons, who said, "Nancy, even if you couldn't dance a step, I would have had you in our charity show. Why, my dear, you're the talk of the town." Nancy was glad to escape for a short time to the Nickerson cabin on Cedar Lake. Here, the Fontaines, Mr. Koff and Millie, Bess, George, and Ned held a private celebration of their own. At the party, Nancy found herself wondering when another mystery would come along. She had no way of knowing that within a very short time she would be involved in the witch tree symbol. Nancy's thoughts were interrupted when she realized that Henri and Hélène were thanking her and her friends over and over again for what they had done. "You'll never know how grateful we are," Hélène declared. "You saved our lives, our reputation, and our school, and you've done a great service for the struggling, freedom-loving people of Centrovia." "Do you think you'll ever go back to Centrovia?" Bess asked them. The Fontaines smiled, and Henri said, "Maybe someday to visit, after peace is restored. But now we would like to become citizens of your grand country." "How wonderful!" Bess exclaimed. And, Hélène added, tears in her eyes, "We could never think of leaving such a fine friend as you, Nancy Drew. And you, Bess and George, you're just marvelous too." Henri nodded and said, "Nancy, I haven't forgotten my promise of a gift to you to show my appreciation. I shall finish your portrait, and it will be my finest work." "And it should be titled," Ned said, smiling at Nancy, "America's Loveliest Sleuth." The end.